Are you guys ready to do this thing? Let's have a go here. What we are going to be talking about tonight is the Queen's Gambit, and more specifically, we are going to be talking about the top 8 responses that Black can play in this position. So briefly, before we jump into it, we should become familiar with the position. d4, d5, pawn to c4. And the main idea of this opening from White's point of view is that we are trying to just capture this pawn. So we're going to see a lot of lines where Black doesn't even directly defend against this threat. We're simply, we want to just take there and have more center pawns. That's just the basic underlying tone. So all of the main moves, and there's basically 3 main moves that you would see at the highest level of play. When you're talking about Grandmaster games, there's 3 moves, and I bet you a lot of people here could could shout them out if they really wanted to. The big three in this position are the 2 moves that defend the pawn. You're going to see these quite frequently, e6 and c6, and there's even a slightly less common at the higher level, the Queen's Gambit accepted. You can take the pawn. Outside of that, there are actually 5 separate moves that we're going to be going over, putting them in order of popularity, according to the mega database of Grandmaster games, and they all have kind of interesting ideas related to solving the problem of the fact that White is simply just threatening to take here, and another problem that Black often faces, the reason that Black sometimes struggles in these kinds of positions to the fact that Black is sometimes a little bit worse in these positions, is that the bishop on c8 often has a difficult time finding a good home. As we'll see, in a lot of cases, sometimes it's because if the bishop does move somewhere, the queen can come out sometimes and attack the pawn, and sometimes it's that a pawn gets stuck in his way. If Black were able to kind of solve this problem, and they all have kind of a different feel for how they're going to solve some of these problems for Black, well, you know, let's just actually jump right into her. So, and we'll see how things happen. And a lot of these lines, even though they're not as popular, do end up being surprisingly difficult for White in a lot of cases to refute. And starting at number 8, we have the Austrian Defense. So this is one of the rarer moves outside of the top 5. It's only been played in just over 1,000 games, or 0.2% of all Queen's Gambit variations. And this is a very interesting attempt by Black. So our main point was we were simply going after this pawn. We're simply putting a lot of pressure on d5. Our intent is to take it. Black completely ignores this and goes directly after our center. And despite the fact that this is really not a popular opening, it is an interesting try at the lower levels because it's not necessarily so easy for White to demonstrate an advantage, as we'll kind of go through and see. Now, in all of these lines, if they do not respond to our threat, it's almost always correct to simply take on d5. Our point of c4 is that we're going to take on d5 if they don't protect it with a pawn. So here we can take it and we end up with more center pawns. Now, by far and away, the most popular move here is to simply take it back. Queen takes d5, and you get a position that's actually very similar to the Chigorin. And Black can kind of use that to his advantage. It kind of resembles another opening, and he can kind of play as if it is. Another very curious variation, though, and here's where actually the first time we will get Twitch involved, is after this curious move, knight to f6, which is not very popular, probably for good reason. But I would be interested to know what, especially the higher level players would be playing in the chat against here. White actually has a very strong move. There are some okay moves. There's a lot of okay moves for White. But if you guys were facing knight to f6 for the first time, which just has the idea of taking back with a knight, and it's not so easy. It's not so easy to, you know, keep our pawn here forever. We're going to be losing one pawn. Knight to c3 is the most obvious move. And this move is good. White's doing well after knight to c3. Bishop to h6 is just a Twitch answer. Not bishop to h6, but a normal move like knight to c3 is just totally valid. White will be a little bit better. No problems there. But there is an even stronger move. Queen b3 is interesting. It doesn't quite stop Black from playing the move that he wants to play. You might be doing okay just because White's got such a good position, but it also undefends this pawn, and queen b3 is usually only good when you're actually attacking this pawn or putting some sort of pressure on d5. So queen b3 is not the strongest move. D takes c5 is kind of the other move I was hoping people would shout out, because this also is sort of a normal, obvious move, but it's just simply not the best. E4, there we go. Yeah, E4, said by Zote coming in with the E4, is actually a surprisingly strong move. Much better than E3, which has also been suggested. The point of E4 is we're going to lose a pawn, we're going to give one pawn back. So we might as well keep our D pawn, which is doing an awesome job. It's constricting this knight from its normal development. It's making it a little bit harder to play a move like E6. And after the obvious move, knight takes E4, we can now take on C5. And yeah, if you're a stronger player, you probably are looking for moves like pawn to E4. You're trying to make it work. And here it works out to be a very strong move because we've kept this pawn and we've introduced some tactics into the position. So queen to A4 here would be a very nice move, winning the knight. And so obviously if black just simply decides to take back, we're going to have just a good position. We can start bringing the knights out, we can get the bishop out, we can get castled, and we're going to have a pleasant advantage. This pawn is definitely more of a strength than a weakness. So if they just take care, we're doing fine. We just start developing the pieces. Black has another attempt to make the game a little bit more complicated with queen to A5 check. This is check. Maybe you can pick up our pawn. But one immediate problem is it's not super easy to find the best way to block here. We don't really want to put our knight on D2 in the way of our stuff. It's possible. Knight to C3, we can try to work out some tactics, but this is actually not the best way for white to continue. But white is doing actually really well after a semi-surprising bishop to D2, which attacks the queen. And again, there is this tactic. So if queen takes C5, hopefully everybody can see, we just give this check, queen to A4. We'll win a piece here. So this is definitely not on the cards. Black's got to just take. We can take with our queen. And after the trade, we're going to be doing fine, so black will probably grab this pawn. And we actually have another strong move in this position. So again, we have a situation where we'll be doing fine. We can develop the pieces. Nothing wrong with knight to C3, knight to F3, one of these moves. But there is actually a really, really strong move again for white. And this one I think I'll spoil. If you're watching later on YouTube, you can pause and try to figure it out. Maybe we'll give chat a chance. We'll give chat one chance here to see what they would actually play. In this position. It'll give me an excuse to drink a sip of tea. What would you guys play as white? Knight C3, knight F3, great moves. Knight A3. Awesome. Your name is in yellow, but it's Evo Electric. Knight A3. This is an awesome move. It has the tactical point that you're threatening rook to C1, which would win a piece. The queen would have to move away and you'd win a piece. Also introduces the idea of going to B5. And something like this, if you put it on a computer, it's a little bit more than +1. This is just an excellent position for white. The kids are they're doing the Christmas tree up there. I don't know if you can hear them, but if you hear any loud noises, it's kids putting together a Christmas tree. Okay, but this isn't what black should do, but it is an interesting idea. This, if they play knight F6, you can play E4. A very interesting idea to kind of keep in mind. Not that you'll ever get this. This is actually one of the rarer lines you can get. But okay, we come back one more time to the Austrian. And if they take, the most common response is to actually take with the queen. Queen takes D5. And now it's white's turn again. Our D pawn is under attack, so the normal move would be knight to F3. I've drawn you a little arrow there, it appears. We're just threatening to play knight to C3 and get a tremendous position. So black is now not forced, but he probably is pretty much forced to just grab on D4. And we could obviously take right away on D4, but we have this opportunity to exploit the pin on the D file and play knight to C3. And black here actually has to be really careful. If black knows what's up, they are going to be playing queen to A5. This is actually the best move. It's kind of surprising how bad queen to D8 actually is. If you don't study this very deeply, this looks like totally fine after queen takes D4, queen takes D4, knight takes D4. I guess I've drawn a few arrows here to indicate what is actually happening. But this is actually tremendously bad for black. White has a huge initiative on the queen side. And it has to do with the fact that our knights are going to be coming perhaps here to attack the C7 square, perhaps the D5, and we have the additional options of G3, bishop to G2. If you just imagine for a second we don't even bother with anything else, and we just get our bishop on g2. It suddenly becomes very hard to develop this knight because we'd be attacking that square twice. It's hard to develop this bishop because then this b pawn would be hanging. So there are some issues, and it's actually remarkable how bad this position is. But this can be avoided. Black doesn't have to play queen to d8. I'll leave it to your imagination to figure out why it's just so bad. But queen to a5 is the main move. And thank you, Evo Electric. I appreciate it. After knight takes d4, knight f6. Here is a kind of an interesting thing. White here, I don't believe the most popular move is not the best. I guess we can continue with the theme of what chat would do since we have quite a few people here. What white plays here in general is not necessarily the best move, so you guys have a chance here to improve on theory. e3 is being suggested. I would not want to play a move like b3. Ideally, this pawn, if you do decide to move it, it would go all the way to e4, which you can't do right away because there's a pin. But you could work towards making d4 happen. The problem with a move like e3, which is just kind of a fine move, it looks like you're just trying to get the bishop out, which is fine. You want to put the bishop out. The problem is you're blocking in this guy, though. And white really has some serious chances of getting a huge initiative. Other moves being suggested: knight to b3, king to d2, queen a4 check. Trading the queens is probably not what we want. The queen is actually a target. Knight to b3 is one of the better moves. Knight to b3 is probably better than the most common move, which actually hasn't been suggested. g3, there it is. g3 is the most common move that's been played, and it's good, but it's probably not theoretically the absolute strongest white can do. Knight b3 is interesting. If you want to move this e-pawn and get this bishop out, through the normal door, knight to b3 kicks the queen away, and then the goal is you want to play e4. This is one very, very interesting way. g3 is actually the most common way, and then there's a stockfish way of doing it. There's a computer way that I think not a lot of people... There's an idea that I don't think... It's not played at all by humans, so I don't think anybody actually will say it. But there is one other interesting idea. In this position and similar positions, queen b3 is close. And actually, queen b3 is probably the same idea. But Stockfish prefers queen to d3, which immediately threatens queen to b5. Queen to b5 wins. Like, remarkably wins. If you play queen to b5 next, you just win. Which is pretty remarkable. And it, for whatever reason, Stockfish, it really likes in these positions, getting that queen to d3. Queen b3, actually, it looks very similar. You probably have the same exact threat. Oh, Julian said it. My apologies, Julian. Julian saw queen d3 coming a mile away. But the most common move that's played in this position is g3, which has, the same kinds of points. We have this advantage on the queen side, so it's a very reasonable move for a human to attempt. You want to put this guy here and, just tell black that it's not going to be super easy to develop all these pieces. Black is still behind in development. So this should be good for white, but it will be interesting. From here, black usually continues with e5. Now knight to b3, kicking the queen away. You get a position like bishop to g2, and now something like bishop to b4 is the main line, where we'll end it here, but white actually can do one of three different things here. You can just sacrifice the pawn. Kicking castle is a totally good move. Black probably will get into trouble if he does decide to take twice. This is a little bit greedy. Black can take once. If you castle, he probably can grab once. Thank you, Anglo. We are doing a lecture over here, so I appreciate the raid. You can take once, but then grabbing twice is probably going to get you into a little bit of trouble. Probably bishop to a3, something preventing black from castling is definitely going to be huge, huge, huge compensation for a pawn. But, you can castle. You can just offer this. Maybe black can take just one time. You can also bishop to d2 is like, okay. And again, the computer-like queen to d3 is also a very interesting option. Thank you, Aaron, and welcome to everybody that has just come over from the raid. But yeah, we'll leave it here. White is a little bit better. But it is kind of interesting that this isn't necessarily, even though it's the 8th most popular opening that we had just checked out, not necessarily like super, you just refute it, whatever. You're still doing some chess at the end of the day here. Moving on to number 7. The 7th most popular Queen's Gambit position is the Baltic Defense, bishop to f5. And this has been played in a whopping 5,000 games or 0.8% of total Queen's Gambit games all in all. And this one, don't worry, YouTube will never see all this tea drinking. You had to see it here on Twitch. Bishop to f5 is an interesting attempt to solve one of Black's biggest problems in this position, which is what do you do with this bishop? And again, this leads us to some very tempting options as white. This means we can start developing pieces. It introduces potentially at some point maybe queen to b3 to put some pressure is one of the things we always want to look at whenever this comes.
Behind the scenes tea drinking.
All right, thank you, Presta. Oh, don't let YouTube know. They have to come over here to Twitch and follow me on Twitch to see tea drinking live. By the power of editing, they will never see this. But again, in this position, keeping it consistent with White's main idea, when you got this pawn on c4, the main idea was simply to take on d5. If Black doesn't support it with a pawn, c takes d5 is almost always the way to go. And already Black could make a big mistake. But this does have one interesting point. The bishop on f5 often has the idea of taking the knight, which may seem a bit strange at first. Moving a bishop twice to take a... all right, no hydrates, okay? One hydrate, and then we can't be doing the hydrate game. Black is taking the knight on b1, which has the idea not just of trading a bishop for a knight, which you would normally never do. It prevents this move, knight to c3. So for example, if Black just simply took here on d5, knight to c3 is incredibly winning already for White. It's like +2 or +2.5. It's like something really horrible. And the main problem is, even if you play something like queen to a5, preventing us from playing e4 by pinning our knight, simply bishop to d2, renewing the threat of e4. And if it's our turn, we play e4, we follow it up with an attack on the queen, we start this devastating attack on the queen side. It's again one of these positions where Black has to be really careful. He's really playing with fire if he wants to try to play it this way. And it's for that reason that almost all players will take the knight. And this has an interesting implication on the game. This means now our knight will not go to c3. One problem that it might cause for players, the reason you might want to do this, is you get kind of unusual positions. In a lot of cases, we are going to be taking back this bishop. I mean, we always want to take that bishop back. They took us, we're going to take them back. Whenever we do decide to take that bishop, it's actually a curious thing happens, that this queen will be taking on d5 and is sometimes looking at this a-pawn. And it often becomes a question of, can Black actually waste the time and take on a2? And sometimes they can, sometimes they can't. But we do have this opportunity right here to toss in this intermezzo, queen to a4, which is one of the better options here for White. And Black will need to somehow block this check. The most common way is with the pawn to c6, but there also exists the idea of queen to d7. White shouldn't be too concerned about this endgame, the one that occurs after takes, rook takes, knight f6, where it becomes clear Black is going to win this pawn back. But White is totally fine. You play knight f3, and whenever Black is ready to take on d5, you're ready to hit him with e4 and just have an advantage in the center. You also have the two bishops, so White is doing pretty well in this endgame. And it's for that reason that Black will most commonly avoid an endgame, play pawn to c6. Where again, we could grab the bishop right away, and we can instead take on c6. We can throw in yet another intermezzo. And this is simply threatening to take on b7, so obviously there's no time to run away with the bishop, because you're going to get hit with this discovered check, winning a rook and queening, and all sorts of horrible stuff. So now's the time for Black to grab. Now it's our time to take back the bishop. And obviously, Black could definitely consider taking on d4 at this very moment. But there's also another very interesting and perhaps more dangerous option for Black, and that's pawn to e5, which, as you can see by the arrows, introduces the threat of bishop to b4. So here, White, again, needs to be careful. We don't really have time to grab on e5 due to this big check that's coming in. So bishop to d2. Slow down, computer. Bishop to d2 is the way to go. And now, for example, Black can take back. After we capture, they can take back with a knight or with a pawn. Taking with the knight is actually not so fearsome. We're not horribly worried about the check on c2. It's kind of a curious thing. With a rook on b1, this isn't actually threatening a fork. If a knight is here, it's never actually threatening to fork us on c2. We'll have to move our king, and okay, it's not 100% the best, but most players are going to be taking with a pawn. And from here, again, we see this has been black's intention. Black has given away the 2 bishops, but he's arguing, again, I got this d-pawn, and this d-pawn is down there, and it's in your face, and it's going to make it a little bit harder for you to develop some of your pieces. But white can continue, kind of like how we saw in the Austrian defense with g3, followed by bishop to g2. And something like this should be very pleasant for white. Now, we avoided a lot of tricks. The reason black actually plays this, because if this was every game, this is good for white. Most players wouldn't want to play this. But there are a lot of tricks that could have happened along the way. We sort of sidestep them by playing theory. It is important to actually know stuff if you do want to do this, because there are some tricks and you could fall for them, and black can win a lot of fast games. And that's why people do it. So that's it. That's the Baltic Defense. I'll pause for some tea for Twitch viewers only, and if there's any questions, I can answer them, or we will move on. Coming in at number 6, we actually have the Albin Countergambit, and this is a very interesting way for black to get a very exciting, aggressive game. He's sacrificing a pawn, clearing the way for these bishops to get out, and he'll eventually try to get the pawn back and just say, well, I got a lot of activity along the way. And in most of these lines, we'll need to, as white, demonstrate that while black is busy getting the pawn back, you can get some sort of initiative, you can get a lead in development, that sort of a thing. And a lot of people are pointing out the traps, which is interesting because I actually didn't have that prepared for this lecture, but obviously that's kind of the one thing you think of when you think of the Albin Countergambit. And kind of surprising, at least to me, is that this is a whopping 12,000 games, which is 2% of the total Queen's Gambit games in the database. There's over 500,000 games played out of the Queen's Gambit. 2% of them are this position. But yes, so after d takes e5, obviously this is the go-to move. We're going to grab the pawn. Black's main point is, again, to get this advanced established d-pawn. It's temporarily constricting our knight from going to c3. Again, it's kind of trying to make it a little bit harder for us to play e3. People have mentioned the traps. The Lasker trap occurs right here after e3. A lot of people have. So I think you guys actually can't see the database in front of you. But after this check, bishop to d2, d takes e3. The main trap is after bishop takes b4. And I'm looking in the Lichess database, which you guys aren't seeing, and it's about 6,000. It's a little bit less than 6,000 people have actually fallen for this trap. So at a beginner level, I think actually a lot of people will fall for this one. And the main point is you can now give this check. You've sacrificed an entire piece to give a check, where obviously if you grab right away, which has happened 500 times on Lichess apparently, you just lose a piece right in front of your face. So most people will think that they're clever, and you just simply play king to e2. And I think a lot of people already saw from quite a distance here that black has a very powerful move. Obviously, you don't want to just trade. And another mistake that I think a lot of people might make is you might make a queen. But if you make a queen, white doesn't have to take back right away. White can instead take right here and then grab the queen. And yeah, it's a little bit dicey, but he did avoid losing massive amounts of material. The main trap, as pointed out, is to make a knight. This is check. And if you do decide to go back to e1, black actually just gets a huge attack here. I think it goes queen to h4, g3, and then you can go like here and win a lot of material. And there's some other things, but obviously this is something to be avoided. The old famous Lasker trap. So watch out. If you do face it, the one thing to kind of know, in this position, don't play e3. If you play e3, you'll probably get a bad position. Which is why, in a lot of these lines, you should always throw knight f3 in, because it's kind of free. You should always throw knight f3 in, get to this position. And if you really don't want to fall for any shenanigans, just play a3. Just play a3. Nothing bad will ever happen to you. And this actually is how I have always played it. We'll come back and we'll take a look at the most popular move. But pawn to a3, black needs to decide between one of two plans. The main idea of Morozevich is actually to go here, which I think is the best plan. And I think one thing that players were doing wrong with the black pieces is, for a long time, they were playing the most popular move. So if you look in a database, this is going to be the most popular move. But it's really funny, because if you put it on a computer, it's like plus 1.8, or it's something like really bad. It's just not necessarily the best square for the bishop. It has this idea that you want to take the knight and then just win your e-pawn back. But it just turns out, based on lots of theory, that you want to develop this knight all the way to g6 and just take back with this knight. And this guy often goes on e6 or some other square. But okay, from here, the games normally continue knight to d2. And again, black can consider doing this maneuver again. More popularly is going queen to e7, just with the idea of winning this pawn back and getting castled on the queen side. But white actually gets a great position if this does occur. And it's actually kind of a curious thing. Line continues like this, and after black castles, white has a tremendous, like almost +2 position after either castling or playing b4. They're both good. And this is weird because the database I'm using is all like the Grandmaster games. And so this is just tremendous for white. If everybody played like this, you would just win every game with white, just because this position is so good. But I think black can obviously improve at some points here. This idea of against basically whatever white does, just winning this pawn back seems to be working out for black. Still a little bit dodgy. But in real life, it's easy for white to go wrong and make some mistakes. The most popular move, though, has just been to play g3. And white's idea is I'm just going to castle. I'm going to develop my bishop. I'm going to get castled. I'm going to avoid anything. Black can go ahead. Again, this is probably one of the better plans, is just going and winning this pawn right away. But historically, again, the most popular move has been bishop to g4. I think it is worth taking a quick glance at what happens if black does decide to go for this plan. You know, bishop to g2, knight to g6, castles. Black eventually wins the pawn back. And here's again a position where I think players with the white pieces actually could improve. In the database, most players are playing b3, and white has a very, very small edge. Black's actually done pretty well for himself. There are some other interesting ideas. There's knight to a3, I think is one of the more interesting ideas. Queen to a4, I think was a computer move as well. Some interesting ideas here for white. White's always a little bit better. It's a pretty of a trappy opening, but I don't actually have too much more to say about it. So if you're watching on Twitch, you can feel free to ask any questions in general about the Albin Countergambit, while I yet again sip a tea for the viewers on Twitch. Yeah, that'll do it for the Albin Countergambit. Coming in at number 5, we have the Chigorin Defense. And this has actually been played in the database of over 600,000 games. It's been played 1,400 times, or 2.4% of all Queen's Gambits. And in the past on my YouTube channel, I actually have a video on a simple solution to the Chigorin Defense. Again, I think we should just take this pawn. It's very consistent with the overall plan. If they don't defend the center with the pawn, you can simply take there. So that video is available. So I thought instead we'd take this time to kind of look at the main lines. The two more popular moves are knight to c3 and knight to f3. These often are a little bit more dynamic. And the main move is knight to c3. Knight f3 is also a very interesting option. The main line continues with bishop to g4. This is kind of black trying to take control of the center. Black is thinking of potentially taking on c4 and getting a lot of pressure on the d4 point. At this moment is when white usually is grabbing something like bishop takes. Usually they take back with the g-pawn. The queen comes out. And black's main point is he's going to put as much pressure on the center as possible. He's given up a bishop to do it. White is objectively a little bit better in all of these lines, but it's not always so easy to demonstrate. In practice, like, you turn a computer on, this is easy. It's always easy. Like, whenever you look at these kinds of positions with the computer, it's a breeze. You play e3, you defend your center, they attack it again with e5, and it's no big deal. But black actually has a lot of dynamic chances when you're playing this in real life. But anyways, their main plan is they're going to attack, and after knight to c3, they will yet again pin you. And very often, black is going to have two knights versus 2 bishops. So here, a3 is one interesting idea, but bishop to d2 is the most popular. And you're attacking the queen now. We broke the pin. So they usually will take back. And you get these kinds of interesting positions where immediately white actually has a huge threat. White immediately is getting ready for d4, d5, queen to a4, these kinds of ideas. So you do have to be really careful immediately with the black pieces. But queen to d6 will sidestep them, and you get this position. So this is actually, it's very good for white, but again, in real life, it's not always so easy. You know, you have slightly compromised pawn structure. Temporarily, this bishop is definitely not looking good, but you do manage to survive. You get out. You figure out where the king goes. And white should be doing pretty well. Okay, so we return to this position. The other main line is knight to c3, which can be even more dynamic than the previous position, especially after d takes c4. Now comes knight to f3, and after knight to f6, e4 is definitely not the only move for white. It's the most ambitious way for white to play in a position like this. And now we get kind of an interesting battle of, can white maintain the entire center without it just kind of crumbling dynamically in black's hands. So all of black's moves are going to be focused moves such as bishop to g4. We have to pay a lot of attention to what is happening in the center. So black here is attempting to remove one of the defenders of the d4 pawn. So we need to do something about that. Bishop to e3 is the most obvious move that comes to mind. Now bishop to e6. And black often has ideas of bringing this guy all the way over here, pinning this knight. And we get kind of the idea of how black intends on playing these lines. So bishop takes c4, bishop to b4. And now we got to figure out what are we going to do with this e pawn. So the main way of doing it is a little bit complicated. I guess I'll ask the audience. There's quite a few moves here, though, that that can be played. Queen c2 is definitely a serious candidate move. It's actually the most common move played in high-level chess, which looks a little complicated because it seems to temporarily sacrifice a pawn. e5 is also a popular move. It's not as good because of knight d5. It's like, okay, though, you can play this way. I think it's knight to d5 where, you can give up the bishop if you want. That's just, it's not 100% what you want. You can play rook to c1. You can take the knight. It's not 100% ideal. We're going to have to make some sort of concession here as white. But maybe rook c1 and then life goes on. This seems at least playable. But stronger is queen to c2, which at first sight looks like it might be a mini blunder because of the pressure on d4. Can't black simply take this knight and then grab this pawn? The answer is no. It was kind of a leading question. The answer is no. So what will really happen is black will just simply castle here. If bishop takes f3, g takes f3, and now knight takes d4, we have a winning move here with white. And I think some people have spotted it. It definitely has to do with this queen a4 tactic. So right here, our queen is hanging, so we got to be a little bit careful. So we can't play here, and we cannot, at this moment, play queen to a4, because then the knight just goes back, blocks, protects the bishop, everything is great. So the obvious answer is to take on d4. So you grab this knight, and then the point is now if they grab, now this queen to a4 threat, which we kind of saw from afar, now it works. There's not a knight that can go back here, so black will be losing a piece. And I guess it can get more complicated. It could go something like this and b5, but I'm assuming we just sack something like this. Looks like if you go for all of this, you might end up in a little bit of trouble as black. Things can go really bad really fast for black. And so it's for that reason that tactically we're able to play queen to c2, and then we're getting ready. We're going to play either castles or rook to d1 and be able to support the center. But it has been kind of a balancing act. Castles, rook to d1. At some point, we're probably going to get a structure where black is taking on f3 and we get some sort of compromised structure. But the center is intact. We have the two bishops. It's tricky. So black is doing all of this because it is a little bit tricky. White's objectively a little bit better. But, it's chess, so we're still playing. The Chigorin is a very interesting one, which is why in the past I've always recommended in this position. There's a video out there. If you want to see my recommendation, you can check it out on YouTube. But yeah, if they don't defend the center with a pawn, just take it. It's always a good move. And these usually tend to lead to simpler things. I guess I can show it here just for, I guess we can just show it again. The main points here are, we're going to be playing e3. It's very similar. Black has the same ideas of playing either king to e5 or pawn to e5. Probably pawn to e5. It's going to be very similar. Black is going to want to bring out the stuff to get as much pressure as possible. Bishop d2 is actually the absolute most popular move here, and it's a good move. I like this a3 move, which keeps it very simple. It's also kind of funny because all we've really done is we've moved the pawns over and over again, but it has kind of the idea. Then after, for example, here, we're going to get the same kinds of Chigorin ideas. c4, d5 is always what we kind of want to get in. And after the knight moves away, the basic plan is to maneuver this knight over to c3, play bishop to e2 and castle. And on the queen side, we might have ideas of playing a4 and bishop to a3. So whenever we play a4, which we can do right away, they always want to kind of be able to meet this. Often they go here. And they go into this pin. And this is supposed to be fine, but in real life, even against high-rated players, I found that they sometimes struggle. They get into this pin, and it's not always so easy for everybody to solve. And other than that, the thing to remember is this knight's not really going to f3. Knight's going all the way over to c3, bishop to e2, and you castle. And I found this to be very a pleasant way for white to kind of handle these kinds of positions. So if you're looking for a consistent way of, they don't protect it with a pawn, we take with a pawn. Feel free to give this one a look. It's also a pretty interesting way of combating the Chigorin. So moving right along, number 4 on our list is the Marshall Defense. And this is still only about 2.5% of total Queen's Gambit games. So this is the last of kind of the less common, the less popular openings in this this portion, and then suddenly it's going to skyrocket. The big 3 are coming up next, but the Marshall Defense at the amateur level, you see this all the time. So this one is actually really important to know what you're doing against it, and hopefully by now. Oh, thank you, Lance. I appreciate it. 3 months. I really appreciate it. Following the same very basic principle. The reason that this is not necessarily so popular is white can do the same exact thing. Black did not defend the center with a pawn, so you just take it. C takes d5, always a good move if they don't defend the center with a pawn. And from here, black will take. And if there's any strong people here, they're going to fight me. We're about to have a fight. If there's any strong players, this is usually where all of the disagreements start. Because every top player I've ever talked to, they love knight to f3. Knight to f3 has kind of the idea of taking control of this e5 square. But as a lot of people have pointed out, there's also e4, which is the most aggressive way. Knight f3, terrible. e4 is definitely the most aggressive way. And normally the reason, this would be good, they say, so they say, except for one variation that gives black good chances. From here, black will decide where to go. There's only 2 safe moves. Everything else loses a piece. Occasionally you run into this one. Occasionally knight to b4 is played. I've seen this one actually quite a bit when I play lower rated players. But this simply loses a piece to queen a4. And if they go back or they block with another knight, you're going to run into d5 and they're going to be losing a piece. Sometimes that happens. But more often they're going to go to b6 or f6. And the line cited as being the problem line for the e4 variation is knight to f6. So I did a little bit of research. Knight to c3 is our point. And from here, black most commonly plays e6. We'll come right back to e5, sorry. In any position where white gets this, the main battle plan for white, the most important thing to know, is we're always waiting. We're never playing knight f3 until e6 hits on the board. The reason is we're waiting for this bishop to be bad. This bishop to not have a home coming out on this diagonal. So if you ever put this knight on f3, like let's make a stupid move for no reason. If you ever give black the option of playing bishop to g4, he solves one of his major problems. I'm noticing queen to b3 here, but in general, maybe queen b3 is probably good. In general, if black, under normal circumstances, gets to bring this bishop out to g4, he might be getting kind of an easy position to play. So essentially our strategy is we wait for e6 and only then bring this guy out. But anyways, they say that if you put this pawn on e5, this is the variation that makes this playable and okay for black. And I thought it was interesting, so I had a look. There's one very interesting line here that is not popular at all. I'm looking now at the Lichess database, so I'm taking it back slightly. It looks like this is a popular amateur move. It's the second most popular move. It looks like 6,000 people have played d5. 3,000 people have taken on e5 on Lichess. But just going in for it, just taking on d5, which at first kind of looks impossible once you see the next couple moves, is a very interesting way for white to continue. Because now queen takes d1, king takes d1, knight to g4. Looks like this is the problem. Black is just simply threatening to fork. Black is simply thinking of potentially taking the e-pawn back, so black's going to win material back. And this looks very dangerous. But there's a really sharp move here for white that is not popular at all. In fact, looking at the Lichess database, I don't see it anywhere. What would you guys play here as white? I think we got to be really careful now. We could play like king e1 and just let him take this guy back. And maybe we're doing okay there. Maybe that's fine. f4 just allows the fork. So f4, knight f2 is one of the major issues here. We're dealing with this fork. We got to figure out what to do. Knight d5. Does knight b5 cut it? I don't know. Maybe this is easier to defend. Maybe this... The answer is knight d5. I want to understand 100% why. I'm kind of curious why I can't just play knight h3 here. We can kind of do the same thing. But maybe here, maybe he's going to develop stuff first. Might be possible for white. But knight to d5 is actually the main move. And I guess the point is you're not blocking this diagonal for the bishop. So if you go here now, it looks like we can just simply grab this knight. So a huge point is that we need to be able to threaten to take this guy. So knight to d5 is this crazy move. Threatening a fork. In the face of a fork, we threaten a fork. And now the lines just go crazy, out of control, and we're no longer in human territory. We just go into kind of like computer perfect play mode here. Obviously you don't have to allow all these complications as white, but it's interesting to know that you can and that they do work out. So for example, the best move is knight takes f2. Any attempt to just safeguard this now doesn't work. Obviously you can't go with the knight because we just simply take it. If you move here, you're running into this sort of bishop a check, and if you go here, you're running into, I think maybe it's just knight h3, and we're better. Eventually there's a check. Eventually you run into something. It's like here and if here. Eventually you run into something, somehow, some way. There was a bishop check. But this is like good for white at this point. The king doesn't really belong here. It looks a little silly on e7. But anyways, let's just enjoy this computer line. They take. And again, there's some funny stuff. We can go to e1 or e2. The computer prefers e2. If we go to e1, there will be cases where this check is a little bit annoying, especially after our knight moves. So we can go to e2, blocking our bishop. They will take. Now we can take theirs and go grab their rook, bishop to g4, and eventually both of these knights will get caught. Eventually both sides will work toward winning the other knight. I don't know that it makes too much sense to get into the nitty-gritty. Eventually all the knights are won, and white has a slightly better position. Look at that. So you can go in for it, which I think is just kind of an interesting way. It's interesting you can allow these complications and end up with a better position. Obviously, it's still messy, still complicated and murky. You wouldn't want to do this without prep, but I don't know. It hasn't ever happened in human play, so chances are nobody's actually going to be prepared for it. I just thought it was interesting that you actually can allow pawn to e5. We won't be doing any redemptions until after the lecture here. But yeah, that's what happens in the martial defense if they play knight to f6. And obviously if they don't play knight to f6, they play pawn to e6, then everything's fine. We start developing our pieces, and it'll be very similar to the lines that we're about to look at. Because the other option, which is slightly more common, is knight to b6. And after knight to b6, we play knight to c3. And again, we are sort of hesitating. We're sort of waiting. We want to play knight f3, but we want this guy to be bad. And at the moment, this guy doesn't have a lot of good squares. This is silly. This is silly. That's not good. This would be good, but only if there's a knight on f3. So if they play e6, which is actually the most popular move, we get a great position. The point is we're going to play knight f3, and you don't actually have to know too much theory. You can be better simply by developing and castling, and then just eventually getting all your stuff out. Maybe you'll develop this at some point, or this guy will just come to the center. You can just slowly develop your pieces and just be better. You also have excellent chances for an attack, because without a knight on f6, eventually you might be able to play bishop d3, play e5, kind of aiming over here. And sometimes there's ideas of not castling and just playing h4, knight g5, queen comes in. You might be able to get a really fast checkmating attack. So either just by demonstrating this guy's bad or getting an attack, white is doing really well here. On a related note, if they instead, how else can they do it? You know, if they decide to play something like this, we would again want to play here. d5 is fine. But the main point is we don't want to play knight to f3. We could instead play something like bishop to e3. d5 is fine, but this is like a simple way of doing it. And again, it's looking around. It's hard to find a very good move for black to get this guy into the game. You can put him on g6. You can go like this if you want to. But if you ever play e6, yet again, knight f3. And now the game kind of continues from here. So this one is an important one because I think at the beginner level, a lot of people will play it. And this is just really good for white. It's always at least +1. You put these kinds of things on the computer. It's always like at least +1 just because black has a bad piece and might suffer a rather horrific checkmate if he does decide to get castled on the king side. So this one's interesting, and it's important just because it is played so frequently at the amateur level. So now, are you guys ready for the big ones? We're about to jump into the big territory here. We're going to take a huge leap up. So the Marshall Defense was actually 2.5% of all Queen's Gambit games. And we are now jumping to number 3, which is the Queen's Gambit Accepted. And out of the 600,000 games, 65,753 were the Queen's Gambit Accepted. So we are jumping up. We are launching to 10%. 10.8% of all Queen's Gambit games. And obviously, this is an important one. If you've never seen this position before, it's obviously important to know, well, what if they take it? What if they take my Gambit? And there's two main solutions here. I know, we don't know what to do anymore. Every single other option, it's just been, we just take on d5. And the Queen's Gambit Accepted not only takes that away from us, takes our one big trick that beat all the silly stuff, but it actually, in a way, is a clever way of trying to solve the problem of this bishop. Because black probably will end up with this pawn on e6. But on the queen side, we'll be playing moves like c5, a6, b5, trying to get this bishop on the other diagonal. Now, the reason this isn't super popular across all of the levels is that it's kind of boring. If white kind of just wants a draw and is a really high-level rated player, it's not going to be easy to win this with black. So for a lot of people, and in recent times it's been Fabi, they're going to make a ton of draws, but Fabi does pretty well with this as black. So we're getting into some serious... This is actually like a good opening, but nobody ever really plays it, because if it's kind of like a draw weapon at the highest level. But for like amateur players, this is something that really isn't played as often as it really could be. And white will have a couple of different options. There's sort of the normal option, the most common way of going slow, playing knight to f3, playing e3, picking up this pawn very gradually. Black never really is threatening. There's like a million traps. If black ever tries to get greedy and hold on to the pawn, it never truly seems to work out for black. But if black is just kind of patient and doesn't really try to get the pawn back, knight f3 followed by eventually taking the pawn is a normal way to go. And then there's also e4, which is a little bit more aggressive and way more theoretically demanding. So if you do want to play e4, which is a very critical move, you need to book up on like 5 different variations. But for example, let's start with knight to f3, and we can come back to our main position. After knight to f3, again, we kind of have this idea of taking control of e5 square. So, maybe black will never be able to go here. Something like knight to f6, pawn to e3, e6. We're going to see black do kind of all of the moves that he wants to do. White can slowly win this pawn back. And now c5, and these moves kind of come in different orders, but the main plan is a6, b5, get this guy over here, and then it's going to be easy. You'll find a good square for this knight. Maybe it's this square. Maybe this guy gets over here. And white, for his part, will get castled, and if a6, choose here, this is actually the main starting point where there's tons of theory. White has tried a whole bunch of stuff. The most popular move is a4, which at first looks like the most logical. Black's idea is to play b5. So we stop it. We play pawn to a4. And it does stop b5, but kind of at the cost of giving up the b4 pawn. Many other moves have been played. D takes has been played, bishop to b3. There's other moves that have been attempted here by white. This is like a huge branching point for theory in this position. But the most common move is a4. And the way black will continue now is knight to c6. This is now a very good square for the knight. It puts pressure on d4, but it also has some ideas of hopping into the b4 square. And if white does decide to play this way, he very often will end up with an isolated pawn, which is not the end of the world. So queen to e2 takes. White here has the opportunity to not take back right away, because it looks like if you just take back right away, it looks like, wait, what are we doing? Are we losing a pawn? Are there tactics? Are we going to do a gambit? Well, actually, white normally is going to play rook to d1, create this pin on the d file, and then only later take back. Something like bishop to e7, just getting ready to castle. E takes d4 is by far the most common move. You get this isolated pawn position, where after castles, knight to c3. Black has two very good options. The most popular is just to jump right in here to d5. There's also knight to b4, which has the idea of maybe hopping this guy back in. And when you have this isolated pawn, generally white is going to think aggressively. He's got to get these pieces out pretty quickly. He's got to be thinking about how can I get d5 in, getting rid of the weakness, but also maybe activating a lot of my pieces in the center. And I think there's a lot of games. Here's where a lot of top-level players have just made a really, really boring draw. Obviously, there's still some fight here. People can keep playing. But just to show how equal it is, a lot of games have gone queen to e4, knight to f6, queen to e2. And a lot of top-level games, like thousands, have gone like this. And they just make their draw, and they're happy, and that's the end of the game. There's more life in the position. People can keep playing here. But it is, objectively, it's really close to equality. The Queen's Gambit accepted is by no means a bad move. We're not looking at any of the dubious stuff anymore. So running it back, we also have the option in the original position, so black has just captured our pawn, of playing e4. However, now we need to be ready for a lot of moves. So that is boring. Yeah, I agree. It's boring, which is okay for some people. Some people are fine with that. Maybe you're just trying to get some very small advantage and take it from there. But if you're looking to liven up the game, you can always consider playing e4, which just has the obvious idea of, I'm going to get this guy back, develop all my knights, live the happy life, get castled. What could go wrong? So black here actually has tons of moves. There's e5, knight f6, like everything is a move. Everything that's like kind of conceivably playable is a move. b5 is a move. b5 is actually kind of interesting, trying to hold on to the pawn. Even at the sometimes you lose this rook, you lose an exchange, and I don't know. There's a lot of complicated theory that you actually need to know if you do want to play this. We'll just look briefly at two of them. e5 is actually the most popular move that might be played. Normally it goes knight f3, just protecting the pawn. And after takes, we want to take on c4. The main idea, you can actually take here, but yeah, it's just not as popular. If you do decide to take here, I think black just gets on with life. I think it goes like here, and then maybe bishop to c5, c5. These kinds of moves sort of enter into the position. But anyways, white is supposed to grab this guy. And now after knight to c6, get castled, and bishop to e6 is meant to be the way for black. And from here, things are not necessarily so obvious. There's this interesting move b4, but we're kind of straying off the path here. There's tons of theory that you need to know at this point if you do want to play this. Another very common line is knight to f6, which can be met with e5, knight to d5, bishop takes c4, and you get a position that's kind of similar to certain Sicilians, certain c3 Sicilians, where after the dude goes back, you might want to. It looks like in the past they used to play bishop to b3. Recently, people have been considering bishop to d3, which doesn't hang upon, because there's this check here. But this has seemed to be scoring a lot better for white. So I don't know if there's any exact questions, if you guys have any true questions about what happens if they take their pawn. If not, we're kind of entering this weird phase where there's going to be way too much theory to actually mention everything in a short lecture here to make it as concise as possible. But b4 is thematic. This is actually one of the more interesting lines. If in this position, I guess you're talking about the other position, but b5 here is also a very interesting move. And there's a lot of the Anand games, as mentioned, are super instructive for Queen's Gambit, accepted for sure. How does this line go? There's one line that, if I can remember it right, is very interesting, that I think a lot of players might want to consider. You play knight to c3, and it looks like black is actually getting himself into a bit of trouble, because if you play pawn to a6, you're actually losing this pawn, right? I mean, this is horrible, but this is actually a line, and this is a very interesting line for black. You can just take this knight. There's this pin on the a file, which is always a consistent theme in these openings, but here you can sacrifice an exchange, play bishop to b7, then debate with a colleague that I have for like 1,000 years as to where this guy should go. There's like both these squares, and we can argue for 1,000,000 years which one is better. And then how does it go? You don't take right away for some reason. Well, I get some sort of initiative if you take right away. So you play like e6, f3, and this line keeps going on forever and ever. Black tries to attack the center, and it can get really dangerous because at some point, like this check is coming in, and this knight starts hopping in, the queen starts hopping around. It can be a very dangerous line. It's an interesting one to look up. I might make a separate video just about this line because it's a really interesting line that requires quite a lot of deep study. But you can sack an exchange here and just play against the center. And it's a really fun line to actually take a look at. It's an interesting way for black to play. And that's the kind of thing that you're going to need to know. If you decide that you don't want to be boring, as mentioned by chat, if you don't want to just go like this, get the pawn back, get an equal position, if you want to play e4, you got to be ready for a ton of stuff. So book up. If you play e4, my advice is book up. But it's a good way to play against it. It's just a little bit harder. So keep it easy or book up. Those are the choices. And that's the Queen's Gambit accepted. Moving on to number 2. And this is actually probably the biggest surprise to me, because when I think of the Queen's Gambit, obviously I think of the Queen's Gambit declined. That's like the normal variation. And the Queen's Gambit declined and the number 1 defense are actually super, super, super close. So at the highest level, people are going to defend this pawn with another pawn. And bishop and pawn to e6, Queen's Gambit declined. We are skyrocketing now. This is 242,000 games, or 40% of all Queen's Gambits. So at the highest level, the Grandmaster level, this is the number 2 most popular way of doing it. And we just went from 10% to 40%. So this is way more popular than anything that we've seen before. And, okay, this kind of means there's still a good case to be made for going here. Not immediately, because sometimes you let the bishop out too early. But after knight to c3, knight f6 is kind of the main move. There are other situations. If you do play it, I don't know how to exactly address this, how to kick this one off. There are some other interesting options for black. I do feel like when it comes to the Queen's Gambit declined, the best way is not even to, what's nice is that you don't actually have to memorize too much theory. You need to memorize ideas for white. So, as white, here I do like just playing the exchange variation. It's very consistent with every other d4 opening that we've played up until this point. And right away, you get the Carlsbad structure. So this is like the most famous structure in all of chess. So imagine there's no pieces. Just get the pieces out of your mind for a second and take a look at the pawn structure. White has a minority on the queen side. There's 2 pawns looking at all these 3 pawns here. We're kind of doing the same in the center. And then we have like this 4-on-3 over on the king side. And what that means is that there's 2 main plans for white, as we will see. One is to do kind of a minority attack, get these pawns rolling up the board as fast as possible. Don't play b3, play b4 in one go, and try to play against black's pawns. And the other idea is to play in the center. So after we make a few more moves, like bishop to g5, the idea is we want to play e3, get our bishop out, but we want to get our bishop out first. Black can play a lot of moves in a lot of different orders. You can play bishop to e7, you can play c6, you can even play knight b to d7. Obviously, this is... And whatever they do, white will try to do the same things, and there's a couple traps here that will need to be avoided. But, for example, after bishop to e7, e3, what we need to know is we are going to develop our bishop, and we're going to put this queen on c2, and then we're going to decide where this knight goes. The big decision for white is actually where the g1 knight goes, which is weird. Normally, this is just obvious. You put it on f3, but that's not necessarily the most popular way of continuing. And for black's part, he's going to get castled. He's going to be putting this guy probably on c6. Eventually, he's going to try to conquer like the e4 square, do stuff on the king side. And for example, castles, bishop to d3, c6, these kinds of moves. It's good to get this guy out before black has the chance of playing bishop to f5. Something like queen to c2 is the most flexible. We're always trying to create some threats. We're threatening to take this knight, remove the defender of the h-pawn. So every now and then you win a free pawn because they just don't defend it for whatever reason, and you win a free h-pawn. But normally they're going to defend it in a couple different ways. Usually they do it with a knight. They can also play h6. If they play h6, there are some plans that black sometimes has that they're not allowed to do anymore, but h6 is just basically always met with going back. And if this knight ever somehow gets to move here without losing anything, usually the idea is that we just want to trade. Those are just ideas to kind of keep in mind. But the most popular move is here, and this is sort of the main position where I want to start. There's two main plans here for white, and they involve either putting this knight here or putting the knight on f3. And the earlier plan, the most popular plan, was knight to f3. This is obviously like the most logical move, and this is actually the move that I prefer, but it's no longer the most popular plan. When you put a knight on f3, obviously your idea is you got to play on the queen side. So you might get castled, but you're going to put your rook on b1, you're going to play b4, b5, and you're just going to try to take here and say that that's a weakness. You're going to try to use all your rooks, you're going to use the c file, try to create a backward pawn, and try to win on the queen side before black has any time to checkmate you on the king side. I actually have one game. There's a game I can probably find and show you that I think is a really model Karpov game on how to do it. As pointed out, castling, which you can do now or you can do in some other lines. Usually you put your knight on f3 first, I think. Castling queenside is also an interesting option for certain players, like in a line like this. A lot of people have actually castled. It's not like 100% correct, but it's fine. If you want to get castled on the queen side instead of going king side, you definitely can. The reason people don't is that they hate fun, and secondly, people don't because it's just so safe and good for white. Castling is just good for white, and this is like, it creates a little bit of who's going to checkmate who first into the position. So most people prefer the safety, the clarity of castling on the king side. But you can, you want to live life? It's your life. Don't let people say you can't castle queen side here. But anyways, the most popular plan in the position involves f3 and e4. So for example, if they play rook to e8, you can get castled, and at some point after like knight to f8, play f3, and you're going to be trying to play for e4. Often this will be after a lot of preparation. Maybe it's you bring this rook in, maybe this queen has to defend because they attack this pawn a little bit early. Maybe they kick this bishop around and the bishop has to go to f2, which also kind of secretly defends everything. Sometimes you want to put this king on h1 before you break through just to make sure stuff doesn't happen in the center, and then some queen to b6 hits you when this pawn's been moved. Sometimes you want this knight on g3 to support it. You play e4 super slowly. You take your time. You chill out. Hey, speaking of chilling out, one guy that loves to chill out. Love Fong. But yeah, anyways, so you're chilling out. You're playing for e4, and you spend a million moves to do it. You play king to h1. You bring this other rook over here. Eventually you play e4, and if you get e5 in, and then you get f4, f5, f6, you can see why a lot of players might be tempted to go for this plan. I do want to take the moment, though, to show a game, if I can find it in here without breaking everything. So, perfect. They actually have this game on Lichess. This is the game between Anatoly Karpov and Ljubomir Ljubojevic, and it was played in 1989. And this is actually like a supermodel game, but it's not quite as popular. Thing is cut off. Boom. So this is the game between Karpov and Ljubojevic from Linares 1989. And this is just like the model game of how to do the minority attack on the queen side. And it's not a super famous game. But okay, the game continued with rook to e8. Some people mentioned you can castle queenside here. That wasn't for Karpov. He's just definitely going to castle on the king side because white's a little bit better and castling queenside is a little bit risky. Knight to f8 was played. This is actually the most common move. And now rook a to b1. And we can get the idea of what white is up to. He wants to play b4, b5 and just simply take here. Knight to e4 was played. And it's always tough. I find sometimes for black it can be tough because you need to trade some of the pieces in order to just kind of free yourself. But black also needs to rely on some sort of kingside attack. You basically are stuck with two plans as black. You either get some sort of kingside attack or you just have to say, well, this position is so solid, I just hang in there. And, in worst case, we're hanging in there in a slightly bad position and we make a draw. And it's a very, very solid opening. So it's very possible. You can just hang in there even if you have a weakness. But okay. The other problem, though, when it was kind of demonstrated, he makes a lot of really nice moves in this game. He just kind of traded easily, flawlessly down into some endgame, traded a lot of stuff off, and then just won an endgame. It was a totally Karpov game. Bishop takes e7, queen takes e7. This is the normal reaction here. And in this position, he played b4. Okay, so far, nothing out of the ordinary. Our intention is to play b5. And black responded kind of in a usual way. a6. And then if they ever play a6, the normal response is a4, renewing our interest of playing pawn to b5. Okay, now came bishop to f5. And it's here that white starts making some pretty interesting decisions. Why knight to e4? Knight to e4 is a very typical idea for black to remove some of these, to get control of this e4 square. So you go here because it trades up these guys, and then you get kind of control of this square. And one thing that you're kind of hoping for, I guess we can show how this might go totally right for black. There are lines, people often play stuff like bishop takes e4. The kind of position black is hoping for is to get a pawn on e4, after you go back to d2, for example, getting this guy all the way over to f5. And you can get some dangerous attacks, like b4. Somehow you can get some dangerous attacks in these kinds of positions. Sometimes, though, black gets pretty big attacks. He's hoping to get like a pawn here and then play f5, and then try to start some sort of attack on the king side by pushing all the pawns or bringing... Sometimes it has to do with bringing this queen and knight very close to your king. Okay, but as we were... okay, sorry. I spoiled the move. In this position, he played knight to e5, which is an interesting move because it allows just pawn to f6, and he's just going to have to go back. So I thought it was kind of interesting for that point. But the main point is here, he's interested. If this knight starts going over to g6, he just wants to trade. So he's just saying, I'm not going to let this knight get closer to my king. Black would really love, to start getting this knight closer over to the king. So if you want to go here, we're going to trade. And that was kind of his plan. He sort of just traded everything off. And the next series of moves was actually pretty interesting. These are, two top grandmasters. So one guy centralized his rook. So Karpov centralized his rook. And the rook's on b1 and c1. They actually make a really good impression. He's still going to play b4 very soon, create some sort of weaknesses over here. And the rooks make a lot of sense where they are. Okay, knight to g6 was played. And again, a very interesting decision. Obviously, the point was to take on g6. And that's fine. He might take on g6. But first, he played a very unusual move. Bishop takes e4. And he's just going to seamlessly get rid of all of the minor pieces. Bishop takes e4. Knight takes e4. D takes e4. Knight takes g6. H takes g6. b5. And with all of the minor pieces off the board, white will never get checkmated. And he's just going to flawlessly, with Karpovian technique, take over on the queen side. So white's under no danger and just has a very good position now. Why black has to take with the bishop. If you take with the pawn, which maybe would be better, but the main point is black. There are some dangerous attacks, but they're all all of the dangerous attacks usually involve this knight. So as long as we're able to get this guy, no matter how you take back here, I don't know which way you guys would want to take back. Let's just take with our bishop, for example. A lot of the dangerous attacks have to do with this knight eventually coming to h4 with some potential sacrificial ideas. Let's see if we can set one up. Let's see, how can I mess up this position in such a way that I can demonstrate the thing. The problem is this move. This move is actually it's kind of a good move. It's stopping all of the threats I'm trying to create with black. Sometimes if you can get this knight all the way to h4, you're threatening weird stuff like bishop to h3, where if you take, then like this queen enters and you might get checkmated. So you're trying to create all of these like subtle, very interesting threats. So, but as long as we get this knight, we're usually pretty fine. He could definitely have taken with the pawn, but white is doing well just by simply taking here, and then however you take back. Let's take with the h-pawn this time, see if it feels different. White will just be doing well, and still doesn't really... He's not going to get checkmated. Okay, but we return back to the game. After all of these captures, he just gets this this very nice endgame. Where, okay, he just has this... The a-pawn is a little bit weak. He goes after it, and again, he just trades. And now we're playing a 2-rook endgame, where just the a-pawn's weak. And, you know, he's Karpov, so he blockades the pawn. He threatens to win it. Now the rooks are all tied down. So he starts over here, and the king is just going to enter. The king just enters. The king comes in. When the rook gets attacked, it has to move away. Goes to the second rank, you know, keeping the second rank defended. Black eventually gets liberated. And probably in these kinds of endgames, it's going to be really hard if you trade a rook. Usually in these kinds of endgames, 2 rooks makes it really easy to keep attacking. If you trade a rook, if you trade 1 pair of rooks, the defensive task for black becomes a lot easier. So he keeps the rooks on. And yeah, he's going after this guy. King kind of ran in. This is probably really close to winning for white at this moment. Black decides to swing over, attacks the h-pawn. Eventually got the king over here. But yeah, okay, now he lost a pawn, and things are about to get pretty grim. 2 rooks are kind of attacked. This rook is attacked. This guy's going to go here. So yeah, how will black deal with all of this? Yeah. At this point, black decided to resign. This guy is a little bit too weak, and yeah, I don't know, it was just easy. It was just a flawless game where he just traded all the minor pieces and then just broke through on the queen side. And it's 100% what you want. If you play the minority attack, if you're playing the knight f3 variation, that's 100% what you want to do. You want to get that there, you want to trade like all the minor pieces, don't get checkmated, and then just break through and be Karpov, and then you win all your games. Not easy to do in real life, but that was just, I thought, was an interesting model game. So that'll we went kind of deep there on the Queen's Gambit declined, and we still have one more to go. So let's do the #1 most popular move in this position according to the Mega Database, and that is the Slav Defense. This actually was a real surprise to me that the Slav is actually more popular than the Queen's Gambit declined. I was shocked. I thought Queen's Gambit declined would be a little bit more popular. But the Slav Defense, turns out, is most popular at the highest level. Very similar in amounts. The Queen's Gambit declined was 40%. This is 40.7% of total Queen's Gambit games. But yeah, obviously. So this is over 80% of all the games. This is an additional 10%. And the first 5 things we looked at are the last whatever percent. It'll be slightly less than 10% of all the games. And here again, we have a major problem in that the Slav is yet again a huge amount of theory. Like it would take hours and hours and hours to cover everything that can be played from this point. But I do want to try and point out a lot of the interesting and important variations that can take place. Now, the most common move here for white, yeah, again, you can play the exchange. If you play the exchange here, though, this is the one thing that's very important. Everybody will hate you forever. The problem with the exchange is that it's actually pretty decent, but it's so annoying. It's just so annoying. Everyone says it's drosh, but, white's a little bit better. So it's annoying. Nobody wants to play it as black. If you're pros, though, this is fine, because everything's fine. But you don't want people to hate you. This is the one exception. Not because it's such a bad move. Not because c takes d5 is so bad. But you'll lose a lot of friends. You definitely lose a lot of friends if you play that move. So you want to avoid it. You want to play the real stuff, which occurs after knight to f3. And from here, we're just going to focus on knight to f6. A million lines. Every single move here, there's going to be a branch with a million lines. Knight to c3 is the main way. And here again is a major branch. A lot of players will play the semi-Slav. This is the most popular way of continuing from here. And some people will play the actual Slav. This is the Slav, the real one. So for example, let's just start here with the Slav. We'll come back. We'll show some fun. The semi-Slav is a lot of fun. But this is the normal Slav. And from here, there's a couple interesting options. There's the Geller Gambit. But a4 is the most popular way to continue. We just want to we want to stop b5 from happening. Then we want to play a4, e4, and take back this pawn. So black will typically stop it, bishop to f5, but now comes e3. And after e3, e6, we get this pawn back, and we get a very interesting line where black will now fill this hole, try to pin this knight, and white will be working over the next several moves. First of all, he'll get castled, but he's going to be working to try to get e4 into the position. So black can castle, black can play knight b to d2. Castling is the most popular. Queen to e2, and we try to get e4 into the position. Now at some point, we'll get a move like this. e4, the bishop will go back. Bishop to d3, we have the idea of playing e5 and then capturing this bishop, which is what kind of usually happens. So at the highest level, they see this coming. They play bishop to h5. At some point, we play a move like e5. We're not going to get too deep into all this theory. We get out of the pin. And what white will try to do over, I guess, the next several moves here is potentially get some sort of attack against the king. Which could come in the form of here, followed by like f4 and stuff. There's a lot of interesting things that happen. Very often at some point, this guy will be forced back to g6, and we will trade, and we'll take back, and we'll play knight to g5, and we think we're very smart that we're going to go here and mate them. And then black always has this interesting defensive resource of just putting a knight on f8. And the theory keeps going. This is hardly scratching the surface of what's going on in the Slav. But white has a little bit more space, a little bit more chances for an attack. Black is very solid. This is a totally normal opening that, maybe not thousands, but hundreds and hundreds of games have been played at the top level. The semi-Slav is another very common way for black to approach this position. And here white has kind of a couple options. Again, there's kind of like a slow, easier way of doing it. And then there's the fun, exciting, but you need to know a ton of theory way of handling this. Developing to g5, your bishop to g5, is the sharpest, most aggressive way of handling the position. As mentioned in the chat by JBeast, there's also e3. And this is kind of the slower way to go. For example, knight b to d7. Black is essentially waiting. He's waiting to see if we go bishop to d3, he wants to be able to take, play here, and then there's millions of moves of theory from this position. This is the most common move. Black can go here, black can go here. Bishop to b7 is now the most popular way of handling it. There's other weird stuff. There's the famous Anand game. He plays like bishop to d6. There's millions of reams of theory. A kind of annoying thing that happens if you play this as black is if they go really slow. They play something like queen to c2, which kind of avoids a lot of theory. For example, if you just play bishop to d6, kind of waiting for this bishop to move before they take, they might just play b3, which doesn't really promise white anything objectively, but it's kind of annoying. White just wants to be a little bit better, sit on you, squash you the entire time. More popular is to go here, which I think allows here, but most people are castling and getting on with life. Eventually, you might have to put this bishop on b7, that kind of thing.
This is a great review.
Thank you, JBeast. I appreciate it. But the more exciting stuff is let's get to the meat of it. Let's get to the real good stuff. In the semi-Slav, after e6, bishop to g5 leads to some of the most amazing and exciting variations that there are in all of chess. Really, this is where there can be a ton of interesting things. h6 is interesting. D takes c4 is interesting. There's like Cambridge Springs sort of stuff that can happen. My favorite is by far the Botvinnik variation. This is a very famous line that goes very, very, very deep. It's been reviewed probably just all the way to the very, very end by a lot of top players with top engines. And it's not so clear. It's really not very clear. But it goes e4 here. This gives black the time to protect everything. So he's up a pawn for the moment. But it looks a little strange because you do allow the pawn to go to e5. This is the Botvinnik variation, played by Botvinnik himself. And you allow this pin, and you allow e5 to happen. So you have to play h6, and now duck back with the bishop. Now after something like g5, you have to break this pin. White will take on g5. And there's still some interesting things here. We really can't get into all of it. There's this kind of funny variation with knight to d5, which is bad. It's really bad because it allows knight takes f7, but you can get some fun. You can get a position like this that it is good for white, but you still better know quite a bit of theory if you do want to play this way, because in comes like bishop to b4. I could go all day. We can keep looking at this forever. It's good for white, but it's very tricky. So you might want to know a bunch of random stuff at every turn. There's a bunch of random stuff. But most people are going to take back and play knight b to d7, supporting the knight, so that the queen can move away. And white is going to play g3, bishop to g2, get castled. Black is going to be developing the pieces over on this side and eventually trying to break in the middle. And at that moment, some insanity will ensue. So it can happen in many different ways. I guess most people take the knight. You can also play g3 immediately. Somehow, some way, whenever c5 is played, you'll get d5 on the board, queen to b6, castles, and then after b4, it's just pure insanity. If you haven't seen these lines, it's definitely worth taking a look. Most people are playing knight to a4. There's also an interesting idea of playing rook to b1, where you can't really take this knight because our rook gets too strong on this diagonal. A lot of fun stuff. And this is barely starting. We've barely begun with this variation, but it's a lot of fun. So if you want to have fun and make it exciting, you can't get much sharper than the Botvinnik variation here in the semi-Slav. And I think that actually will wrap it up. I'll be taking questions now for anybody that's watching on Twitch. I appreciate you guys hanging out. This was actually a long lecture. I appreciate you guys spending the time with me. Hopefully this was really helpful. Hopefully people took a lot away from this. I'm trying to, provide the stuff that people really want. So if you are watching this later on YouTube, usually these videos where I do the most work and put the most effort into them, they don't get as many views. I could just go play some stupid Gambit and get 10 times the amount of views, but I want to do this because I think it's something that a lot of players might be interested in, the top 8 most popular variations of the Queen's Gambit. So help me out. If you subscribe, if you like, if you leave a comment, everything helps. I'll be hanging out here on Twitch. You can also come follow me here. And, who knows? Maybe I'm going to start doing a few more of these lectures here. So thank you guys for watching. I'll be taking questions now. And if you're on YouTube, I'll see you in the future. Subscribe!